Hey students, welcome to Mr. Moore's AP European History class. This is your week 3 notes. And as you can clearly see by the title, this week we're going to be focusing on the Renaissance. In class, I'm going to take about 2 weeks to cover this time period that we call the Renaissance. And the Renaissance really started during the 1300s and is going full swing throughout the 1400s. I've clearly written down here that we're going to be focusing on the Renaissance during the 15th century. As a quick review, if I'm talking about dates during the 1400s, I could also say the 15th century. Those two things mean the same thing, and we've discussed that in previous weeks. So this AP European history class starts in the year 1450 and moves us all the way through to the present time. I always try to put an essential question at the beginning of my notes to help me stay on track and also to help your brain stay on track. And so by the time we're done with our notes here today, we want to talk about how does this rebirth or rediscovery of Greek and Roman ideas in Europe affect our world today. So I guess that's the first thing we should do is talk about the actual word Renaissance. And that word Renaissance means rebirth or rediscovery. And what they're doing in Europe during the later 1300s and deep into the 1400s, and depending on where you live, maybe even during the 1500s, people were rediscovering stuff from antiquity, things from the Greek and the Roman world before. So this is the part of class where we need to spend quite a good time focusing on what it means to be in a history class and being able to see things perceptibly as a historian would. In previous notes, we've addressed what the initials AD stands for. I hope in your head you're thinking Anno Domini. It's a Latin phrase that means the year of the Lord. That means that the 0 mark is the birth of Jesus. The BC stands for before Christ, and this is the calendar and dating system that's used in Western civilization. That is the countries and cultures that use Europe as a basis for their own culture. That means any country in North and South America. That means all the countries across Europe. And that means Australia. But if you were listening in my previous notes, you know that Africa was taken over by Europeans, and about 90% of Asia was. So this is a dating system that's used around the world. The first human beings that learned writing and where we can actually get history before prehistoric times sits somewhere about 3,200 BC-ish. You can look up different facts, and different experts have their opinions of when exactly writing was invented. But we're talking 3,000 BC or 5,000 years ago. What I'd like you to do is to reflect on the first thing we want to talk about is the Greeks and Romans. And the Greeks, people have been living in Greece going back to like 2000 BC or before. But when we talk about the height of Greek civilization, like the golden age of Greece, with people like Homer, who wrote the Iliad and Odyssey, or at least who gave those epic poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey. And we're talking about Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. We're starting at about 500 BC. Alexander the Great, he was going on campaign in like the 320s BC, 320 some years before Christ. And after Alexander, the Greek world starts to be overtaken by the Romans. Now, Rome was founded back in 753 BC. So the Romans, the city of Rome at least, existed way back in 700 BC. But Rome wasn't very significant. The Greeks were the dominant power in the Mediterranean up until the decline of the Greek world and the beginning of the Roman Empire. The Roman Republic ends right around the year 0. You get Julius Caesar and Pompey and Crassus and all those huge Roman figures right before the 0 mark. and then you get all of the Roman emperors, starting with, all these important Roman and what we sometimes call the Pax Romana. If you've ever heard that, Caesar Augustus is usually seen as the first real legitimate emperor, even though Julius Caesar was definitely heading that direction. But in the days of Caesar Augustus, that's really when we get the beginning of the Roman Empire and the end of the Roman Republic. So I've kind of put these as basic, time frames to kind of wrap your head around. And when I give midterms and stuff like that, sometimes I like to ask just some basic questions so you can put things categorically in your head. There's nothing on the AP test that is going to actually address the Greeks and the Romans. But if you want to understand the Renaissance, on my title screen, I said that the Renaissance is the rebirth of Greek and Roman stuff. So clearly, we have to understand some stuff about the Greeks and the Romans. And what's going to happen is people who are living over here around the year 1500 are going to be studying what the Greeks and Romans did before. People like Cicero, the famous Roman, or they're going to be revisiting people like Plato, and they're going to translate Plato's writings from Greek into Latin, and it's going to become something that scholars start really looking at again. Writings of Aristotle were used during the Middle Ages, the medieval times, so that's not necessarily rediscovered, but really we get a rebirth of Greek and Roman stuff. So from somewhere close to the year 500 all the way until somewhere during the 13 or 1400s is a time period that we call the Middle Ages. Now, some people like to refer to it as the Dark Ages. Some people refer to it as medieval times. But in most textbooks, you'll hear it referred to as the Middle Ages. Traditionally in my class, I give a summer reading assignment and encourage students to review Greek stuff and Roman stuff and the Middle Ages so that when they walk into my class, their brain is already going on the stuff that happens before this class, because our class is going to cover this 500-year chunk of time up to the present, going back to 1450-ish, okay? So we're right at the end of the Middle Ages, and we're going to start with a huge topic called the Renaissance. And then we're going to address something called the Reformation, and then we're going to address something called the Scientific Revolution, and then we're going to talk about something called the Enlightenment, and then we're going to talk about the Industrial Revolution, and then we're going to talk about the World Wars. That's the 500 years up to the present time. Now, I know that's a lot of information, but I'm going to take this entire year to try to pound that into your head. In California, 6th grade students are supposed to study ancient civilizations like the Greeks and Romans. Again, that's forever ago. So that's why it's always good to brush up on it a little bit. And 7th grade students are supposed to study the Dark Ages, the medieval times, and Middle Ages. That's all the same thing. That's 3 different ways to address the same time period, from about 500 to about 1500, about a 1,000-year chunk of time. So that's really significant that you wrap your brain around this information and you can clearly see where we are. This provides the context for this class. Some students, when they take this AP European history class at first, are a little bit jostled in their brains because, remember, we're going from middle school or even elementary school history into a college level class. And we're picking it up right where the story left off, but you might be like, man, I don't remember, or my teacher didn't teach me very much back then. For most students, the last history class they had was a U.S. history class, which takes place during the same time frame as this class, not the entire spectrum, but certainly just focuses on the United States. We're going to be looking at the entire world. The reason it's called AP European History is because over the last 500 years, Europeans have taken over the planet Earth. Okay, the Renaissance is our first unit, and it's going to overlap the Dark Ages or the medieval times a little bit. And so if you were living during the Renaissance, you might not have noticed much difference. But us as historians, 500 years later, looking back, we can see that things started to change. And historians mark the beginning of the modern world with the Renaissance. I'm going to repeat this again. This class starts in 1450. But the Renaissance does not start in 1450. The Renaissance is not an event. The Renaissance is an era. So, why does this class start in 1450? I hope in this class that you start to ask questions. I'm going to ask questions as the teacher, but an effective student would also ask questions, and they would expect answers. If I ask a question and it's not to your satisfaction, you need to go Google that and search until you get it. That's what true learning is. There are several events that happen in 1450, and one of the most important ones is the invention of the printing press. Now, the invention of the printing press might not seem like a big deal. You might say, oh, there's a lot cooler stuff that's been invented. But if you understand how significant it is to be able to mass produce literature, pamphlets, texts, news, ideas, then you can understand how the printing press changes everything. Please understand that before the printing press, every book that was ever written that people had in their libraries had to be hand copied. Before 1450, if you wanted a copy of the Bible, it was absolutely out of your price range unless you were super wealthy. Books were so expensive because only the rich could afford it, because somebody had to literally hand write the Bible word by word, page by page, book by book. I don't know if you've ever picked up a Bible, and it depends on which printing, and how big the printing is, but it's usually about 1,500 pages. And imagine having to write that out word for word just to get a copy of the Bible, which means that most people were not literate. And most people had to trust the preacher to tell them what was in the Bible. This also gave the church, the Christian church, a lot of power during medieval times, because Christians had to just take the preacher's word for what was in the Bible, or the bishop's word, okay, or the priest's word. And that gave the church a lot of power and authority, and people couldn't really question what the priest was saying, because they couldn't go to their own copy of the Bible and reference that. So that's just one example of the power of the printing press. We'll continue to talk about how significant, but everything changes after the printing press. Things speed up. There was great ideas before the printing press, but the printing press speeds everything up. Now people can get their hands on information at a much more rapid pace. In the 1450s, there was something called the fall of Constantinople. Constantinople was the capital of the Byzantine Empire. Now, this is kind of stuff that happened before AP Euro starts, so before 1450. The fall of Rome usually happens, in history books we talk about it happening around the year 500 AD. However, when we talk about the fall of Rome, actually only the western half fell apart. The eastern half continued to be powerful, and if you need a refresher, you can go back to my week 1 notes, and you can look at how Rome was divided at the fall of Rome. And the Byzantine Empire continued from 500 all the way into the 1450s. And finally, Constantinople was destroyed. So I'm not going to spend too much time on the back history on that one. But in the 1450s, Muslim invaders, this group of Muslims was called the Turks, and they came and invaded the Byzantine Empire, and they destroyed this Christian stronghold and turned it into a Muslim capital. So there was this conflict between Islam and the religion of Christianity. And when Constantinople fell, this opened up Europe to invasion from Muslims. And if you're wondering where Constantinople is today, you would go to the modern country of Turkey. Again, it was the Ottoman Turks who came in the 1450s and overtook the old Byzantine Empire. And that's going to shift everything in Europe, where the Byzantine Empire in Eastern Europe used to be this dominant power. And I can even pause for a second and jump over here and show you a map so you can see what I'm talking about right here. This right here is a little strip of water. It's called the Dardanelles and the Bosporus Straits right here. There is water that allows you to go from what we call the Black Sea, which I'm going to zoom out. This is the Black Sea into the Mediterranean Sea. And where this water goes in between right here, that's the dividing line between Europe over here and Asia over here. This, of course, down here is Africa. As far as the dividing line between Europe and Asia over here, if you were to draw a line from the Caspian Sea to the Black Sea, there's a giant chain of mountains, the Caucasus, the Caucasian Mountains, going through Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia. So going right here, that's the dividing line between Europe and Asia. And if you were to zoom out right here, there's a chain of mountains going from the Arctic Ocean down to the Caspian Sea right here called the Ural Mountains. And that's the dividing line between Europe and Asia. Okay, so Constantinople was sitting right here. It's called Istanbul today. That's the Muslim name or the Islamic name for this city of Constantinople. And it's kind of spread on both sides, although centered on the European side. So Turkey has a little part in Europe, but it's mostly in Asia. And trade from Asia used to come through the Christian stronghold of Constantinople, and they used to moderate all the trade that was going through here. But when the Muslims took it over in the 1450s, everything starts to change, and Europeans start to look for other ways to get Asian goods, which is going to lead directly to exploration. Okay? In the 1450s, a huge, gigantic, catastrophic 100 Years' War ends. In chapter 11 of the textbook, it's going to address some of these things that are happening at the end of the medieval times. And there was a 100-year conflict between England and France. And at the end of the 100 Years' War, there was a girl whose name was Joan of Arc. And she says that she was visited by angels and heavenly messengers, and they told her how to help France defeat the English. And in fact, the people rally behind Joan of Arc, and they're able to kick the English out of France. Now, this doesn't mean that they were fighting every day for 100 years, but over the course from the middle of the 1300s until the middle of the 1400s, England and France were duking it out in a bloodbath. And the 100 Years' War ends with France kicking the English out. And this is going to pave the path for France and England to become some of the dominant countries in Europe. And they still are to this very day. They have some of the strongest economies. But if you were to go back to 1450, both countries would be in absolute ruins. But they're going to come out of the 100 Years' War on top. As has already been stated, we're starting this class in 1450 in the midst of the Renaissance. And generally, historians trace modern history back to the Renaissance. Remember that 1450 is not the beginning of the Renaissance, it's in the middle of the Renaissance. To put an exact date on the beginning of the Renaissance is impossible. But historians can see people starting to review and revisit and rediscover Greek writings and Roman writings and Greek artistic styles and Roman architecture sometime at the end of the 1300s and into the 1400s. And then during the 1500s, those ideas are going to spread into other parts of Europe, but it's all going to start in Italy. So let me revisit the end of the Middle Ages. Remember, when I say Middle Ages, I also mean the same thing as Dark Ages. Some people use those synonymously. If you want to get technical, maybe there's some technicality. Dark Ages might be the years right after the fall of Rome, like 600, 700, or even 800 AD, when the Vikings are raiding, and that's even before the Crusades. But generally, historians will refer to this as the Middle Ages because it's in the middle of the actual Greek and Roman eras and the rebirth of the Greek and Roman ideas. So that's why they actually call it the Middle Ages. And medieval times is an explanation of kind of society going backwards. And the Greeks and Romans did amazing things, and then it's kind of like society took a back turn. The Middle Ages last for about 1,000 years after the fall of Rome. It was a time of superstition, war, and disease. When I say war, think 100 Years' War. That's just one example. When I say superstition, I mean doctors weren't using medical advice to cure diseases. Most doctors would do bloodletting. You know, if a person was sick, they would cut you open and drain your blood. They did that to try to release the evil spirits that were making you sick. So they weren't using science at all. Superstition is the opposite of science. Okay? And of course, diseases like the Black Death, the Black Plague, and we're going to talk about that. One of the key things that happened during the medieval times were the Crusades. And the Crusades were a holy quest where people from like France, people from Italy, people from Germany, people from England went down to Jerusalem and tried to reclaim the Holy Land for Christianity. I'm going to jump over to the map for a second again. Jerusalem is right here. You can see this country called Israel. It's called the Middle East because it's in the middle of Europe, Asia, and Africa. This right here is Jerusalem. And so people from England and France and Spain and Germany and Italy and Poland and other places in Europe, I'm not trying to leave any out, but they were going on quests over here to the Holy Land and trying to reclaim it for Christianity. Because, of course, Jerusalem was the place, like 5 miles outside of Jerusalem is a little town called Bethlehem where Jesus was born. Jesus was killed on a cross in Jerusalem. And so Christians were trying to go back and to reclaim the land for Christians because Muslims had taken it over of the last few years. And so during medieval times or during the Middle Ages, European Christians went there and they attacked Muslims. When they came back from the Crusades, they brought with them a lot of the Greek and Roman ideas that Muslim scholars had preserved. Whereas Europeans were being overrun by superstition, the Muslims were actually preserving European ideas. So it was Muslim scholars that helped preserve some of the European cultural identity. That's kind of ironic. This rediscovery of the classics is known as the Renaissance, and it starts in Italy. When people use the word classics, hey, let's read the classics, or this is classic education, it means it's based on Greek and Roman philosophy and ideas. Okay? So, during the Renaissance, society, education, science, and medicine started to move forward again because during the medieval times, the Dark Ages, society had kind of gone backwards. Education had gone backwards. Medicine had gone backwards. So society was kind of falling apart. Sometimes when we watch movies about medieval times with the castles and the knights and the princesses and all that kind of stuff, it looks really romantic. I mean, it looks really cool. But in reality, it would have been stinky and scary and smelly and dangerous, and it wouldn't have been awesome to live there at all. Castles were cold and dark and not fun. It's kind of fun to watch it in a movie when you're sitting in a comfortable couch eating popcorn, but to live back then would not have been good. The Renaissance is a time of great art and incredible writing. Some of the greatest artists of all times come from the Renaissance era. We'll talk about the names in just a minute. Some of the best writers come from this Renaissance era, and new innovations started. The printing press is just one example. Okay, so when was the Renaissance? Sometime starting in the 1300s, not an exact date. Okay, and it goes all the way through the 1500s, depending on where you lived. If you were living in Italy, say in the city of Florence, then you would have maybe seen these ideas sooner than other places. I'd like to point this out. I'm not going to show this video clip, but you can click on this and it will review medieval times or the Middle Ages in like 4 or 5 minutes. I highly recommend you go to my website, check out my notes, so you can kind of visually see this. Again, I'm expecting my students to understand their geography. That then when they see this landmass, they know it's North America, and there's tons of countries in North America. When they see this landmass, it's South America, and there's quite a few countries there. Africa has over 50 countries. So does Asia, and so does Europe. Okay, so these are the 6 continents, and the first one we're going to focus in is on Europe. And for a test in my class, I need you to be able to look at this map. And right now, if all you see is just black and white lines and it means nothing to you, then you probably already missed some of my class because I've already been throwing out names. Here are the names of the European countries. This is Iceland, Ireland, the United Kingdom of Great Britain. This is Portugal and Spain, France, Belgium and Netherlands, and Luxembourg, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and Finland, Germany, Switzerland, Italy. This island is Corsica, and it's a part of France, so it's not a separate country. It's not like on a map test. It's a part of France. This island and this island are a part of Italy. This is Austria. This is Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Russia is so big that it goes all the way over into Asia. Belarus, Ukraine, and Moldova, Poland, Czech Republic or Czechia. This is Slovakia, Austria, Hungary, Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina. This is Montenegro. There's actually a new country down here called Kosovo. This is Serbia, North Macedonia. This is Greece, Albania, Bulgaria. This right here is not a country. It's the Black Sea. This is Turkey. It comes a little bit into Europe. This island is a part of Greece, but this one is Cyprus, Ukraine. And again, I can't remember if I've named all of them, but you could go Google it up, and I've given all my students a study guide so they can start to learn it. Even a couple that are just barely in Europe, just off my map over here, like Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Kazakhstan. It is possible for you to learn all of the countries. There is even 5 micro countries: Andorra, Monaco. There's one called Vatican, San Marino, and Liechtenstein. And there's 5 micro countries there, okay? And even like Malta, which is a small country down in the Mediterranean. At the end of the Dark Ages, there was a huge catastrophic plague. Some people have been concerned over coronavirus, and I'm not trying to minimize what's happening in the year 2020. But the last time I checked the statistics, there was somewhere around 800,000 people that have been reported to have died from coronavirus. The Black Death killed half of the people. Imagine if the number was somewhere around 3 or 3.5 billion people today. That's how catastrophic the plague was. Again, not trying to minimize what's going on right now, or what's going on or has happened in society or will happen in society, but the Black Death is on a whole different level. Millions died of the disease. At least a third of the people in Europe, and it wasn't just Europe, people in the Middle East and in Asia. It's almost impossible to get exact statistics. I've seen some numbers as high as 1/2 of the people. Imagine every other person dying of the Black Death. And we're talking about getting boils on their body and sores and putrefying, rotting to death slowly before you die. So many people died, they couldn't bury everyone. But for those who survive, life gets better. So what happens is the population shrinks enough that there's plenty of food and plenty of ways for people to be able to find success. So it's a horrific time, but for those who survive, life actually starts to get better. Because of so many deaths, the economy and the social fabric of Europe starts to break down. Here's a key word from medieval times. It's called feudalism. Feudalism is a relationship between the peasants and the nobles. If the king is at the top, and below the king you have the lords and nobles, or sometimes called the vassals, okay? The king would grant a lord or a noble a piece of land called a fief, and all of the people on the fief, sometimes called a serf. Sometimes we just use the word peasant. But we still have some of this medieval language in our world today. Like if you live in Apple Valley and you're renting a place, you don't own it, but your family rents it, you would pay your money to the landlord, even here in Apple Valley in the year 2020. So that's just a reminder that we still use some of this medieval terminology. If your landlord calls you a peasant, that would be offensive and not appropriate, but we still use some of this feudalistic terminology even in our modern day today. One of the things we have to talk about is the power of the church during medieval times. The church was everything. And if I ever say the church, I'm of course referring to Christianity, and I'm referring to something that's called the Catholic Church. So if I ever say the church, I mean the Catholic Church. It's technically called the Roman Catholic Church. It was started back by the Roman Emperor Constantine back in 325 AD. But the Catholic Church is the most powerful religious entity in Europe, and people who are Christian in Europe are Catholic at this point. There are some people in Eastern Europe who are something called the Eastern Orthodox Church, because back around the 1090s, the church does go through a split. But I'm going to deal with that in a couple of weeks with the Reformation. But a little heads up, the power of the church weakened because people start to question why God did not save them. The Black Death is one of those things that puts a lot of pressure on the Christian church because people pray, God save me, but they still die from the plague. Or they see their relatives die of the plague. And so people start to question the Christian church because of the Black Death. So at the end of the Middle Ages, many groups start to break away from the Catholic Church and form new Christian churches. And that's an era called the Reformation. So for 2 weeks, we're going to study the Renaissance. And then for 2 weeks, we're going to study the Reformation. And they both kind of, there's overlap on both of them. I'm going to focus on the Renaissance this week, but I do need to introduce topics as they come up. So if you don't understand what the Reformation is, the reforming of the Christian church, we'll talk about that in a couple of weeks. Again, I have some videos embedded, short videos, like we're talking 3-4 minutes, that would help you to see feudal life in the Middle Ages. I highly encourage you to watch it. Okay, go to my website, pull up the notes, check out the videos as you're taking notes so that you can visualize and see what's going on. If we were actually sitting in class, I would show that in class, right? And we could talk about it. Unfortunately, people, when bad things are happening, people look for somebody to be the scapegoat. They look for somebody to blame their problems on. In today's world, we blame political parties, or we blame the president, or we blame other countries. Back in medieval times, people blamed the Jews for the Black Death. They said that they were poisoning wells, that they were causing it to hurt Christians, or pay back on Christians for that kind of thing, for all the abuses and stuff that was happening. So there was a lot of mistrust. You can see that the worst years of the Black Death were during the 1300s. So that predates this class, because remember, this class starts in 1450. But remember that this sets everything up that's going on in Europe, leading into the Renaissance and leading up to that 1450 start. So this is 100 years before 1450, but it kind of paves the way and it reduces the population. So it's horrific, but the people who live through it, who survive it, and their children and their grandchildren, life starts to improve. So why does the Renaissance start in Italy? Italy was the center of government, religion, and trade. Let me just pause for a minute and remind you of the Roman Empire. I'm going to jump over to my map of Europe for a second because I want you to visualize and see this right here. If you're not familiar with Rome, Rome is a city in the Italian peninsula. So way back at the year 0 and up to about the year 500, that's not an exact date, but just to kind of give you a, circa time, Rome dominated the entirety of Europe. Rome, this city here, controlled everything up into most of Great Britain, all the way down through North Africa, huge chunks of the Middle East, usually around the Black Sea, depending on the year that you look at it, and then up the different rivers right here, like the Danube, and then up the Rhine River right here. So there's parts of Eastern Europe that were never a part of the Roman Empire, but the city of Rome controlled everything. So even by the time we hit 1450 and the Renaissance, is going, you might say, Mr. Moore, the Roman Empire is long gone, but people still remember Rome. And so Rome is, ironically, the center of the idea of government and civilization. Even today, people still call Rome the eternal city and look to Rome as like one of the centers of Western civilization. The other thing that I said is that Rome is the head of the Catholic Church, and that is because inside of the city of Rome, I mean literally inside the city of Rome, is the world's smallest country. I'm zooming into it. It's about the size of Apple Valley High School campus. You could walk across this country in about 5 minutes without even breaking a sweat. This country right here, the only people that live there are priests, bishops, people in the Catholic Church called cardinals, and the Pope himself. So literally you can walk across the street right here into Vatican City, and you are in a separate country that's owned by the Catholic Church. It's the world's smallest country, and it's inside Rome. So anybody who's a Christian kind of looks to Rome as a center of Christianity. Now, if you're a Christian, but you're not Catholic, that does get a little tricky, and we're going to spend 2 whole weeks talking about the difference between Catholics and other types of Christians. So we're not going to dwell on that too much, but I wanted to point that out. Also, if you're familiar with Italy, it sticks right out into the Mediterranean, so it's a perfect place for trade. Anything coming from Africa, it's right there. Anything coming from Asia, it's right there. And it's the easiest port to take things out to the rest of the Mediterranean world. And back in 1450, remember that Europeans didn't even know about Australia, North or South America. The only thing they knew about was Europe, Africa, and Asia. So it was the center of trade, and it was filthy rich. Italy had a wealthy merchant class, banking families like the Medici, especially the city of Florence. And we'll touch on that in just a second. People that have more money than they need to just live can start spending it on things they don't need. They can pimp their house out with artwork, right? And they can give their kids education. Most people have to spend their entire lives farming. But this Medici family had money to spare, and they're one of the examples of people who helped fund the Renaissance. Italy was different from the rest of Europe because Italy was not a united country at this point in history. I'll show you a map in just a minute. Today we think of Italy as one country, but back in the 1450s, it was a bunch of small little kingdoms and city-states. There was an actual city-state called Florence. It wasn't a part of Italy. It was its own little country, if you will. There was a place called Venice. Now, Venice is a city in Italy today, but back then it was called the Republic of Venice. There was like the Grand Duchy of Milan, right? Today, Milan is a city, or Milano, up in the Alps in Italy. A beautiful city that's like the center of fashion in the world today. But back then it was like its own little kingdom. A place called Genoa, and even Rome was its own political entity. There was even a giant country called the Papal States. Now, I just showed you on a map how small Vatican City is today, but imagine back in medieval times, the Catholic Church controlled about a third of Italy, not just a little tiny speck on a map. Today, Vatican City, or the Holy See, is the center of the Catholic Church. But if you go back into medieval times, the Catholic Church owned like half of, or a third of the peninsula. I'll show you a map right here. You see this giant chunk of land? Okay, that was all owned by the Catholic Church. There was a kingdom of Naples, the kingdom of Sicily, the kingdom of Sardinia, the kingdom of Corsica, which by the way today is a part of France, but back then it was very Italian. The Republic of Venice, the Duchy of Milan, right? So you can see there that Italy was not a united country. It was a bunch of small, fragmented places. And one of the reasons that the Renaissance kind of comes to a close, at least in Italy, at the end of the 1400s, is because French armies invade, and Italy is so stinking rich that it also makes it a target. And there was beautiful art and architecture and paintings and sculptures and writing coming out of Italy. And so several countries, but especially France, sends armies in to try to capture some of that wealth. And so we are going to see a shift from the power base in Europe from the Mediterranean, and it's going to start to shift to countries that are based on the Atlantic Ocean. And we'll be talking about that as we get into exploration. You might question why I have pictures of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles in my notes on the Renaissance. But if you know anything about the Ninja Turtles and the Renaissance, you know exactly why I put them on here. The names of these Ninja Turtles are Leonardo, okay, Donatello, we got Michelangelo, and we have Raphael. And that happens to be the names of the four most famous Renaissance artists: Leonardo da Vinci, Donatello, Michelangelo, and Raphael. Those are the most famous painters of the Renaissance era. Next week, I'm going to actually show you some of their artwork and help you to become more familiar with that. But that's kind of a funny thing about the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. They have the names of the four most famous Renaissance painters. I've already addressed the printing press, so I'll get through this pretty quick here. The guy who invented the printing press, or movable type, was Johann Gutenberg. And when I say movable type, if you're going to use one of these old printing presses, you had to have the letters carved in metal or wood, but metal ones last longer, so that takes a long time to make. And if you're going to make a page of a book, you have to hand set every single letter, and you have to do it backward, because when you roll the paper on it, you want it to come off the right way to read. So if you just pause for a minute, I know it's kind of abstract, but you have to set the type backwards, okay? Once you have the page set, which might take longer than it would to write, okay, to set the type, but then once you put the paper on and the ink and you roll it, then you can make hundreds and hundreds of copies. That's where you start to save the time. So 1450 really starts a communication revolution. And Gutenberg's printing press, the number one thing printed on the printing press was the Bible, the Gutenberg Bible. When we talk about Europeans, almost everybody in Europe was Christian. Were there some Jewish people? Yes. Were there Muslims? A few. Almost everybody was a part of the Catholic Church, but people were Christian in Europe, and the Bible was the number one book. The second most popular book printed on Gutenberg's printing press was The Adventures of Marco Polo. That was an explorer who started exploring the world back in the 1200s, but he became popular during the Renaissance. Nobody could afford his book, and copies of it weren't available until the printing press, and it's one of the things that inspired Christopher Columbus to go exploring. The Adventures of Marco Polo. So he was a couple hundred years earlier, but the printing press made that available. One of the most famous writers during this Renaissance era is a dude named Niccolò Machiavelli. He's an Italian writer living during the 14 and 1500s, and he writes a book called The Prince. The Prince is kind of like a how to run a country for dummies book. It shows a ruler how to be an effective ruler. He doesn't tell you how to play nice. In fact, some people think that The Prince is like an evil book because people who use Machiavelli's techniques are not nice people. Machiavelli says if somebody is not respecting you as the ruler, you need to kill a few people to let people understand that you're serious. So Machiavelli's not known for being a touchy-feely nice person, but he is known for being very practical. He's very rational. And that kind of helps us to understand a little bit about the Renaissance. It's kind of taking the emotions out of things and just getting to the raw, here's the reality. If you want people to respect you, you might need to put a little fear in them. If you take over a city and you don't, have a strong hand, a firm hand, then the people are going to get out of control. Now, you don't want to be too mean. If you're too ruthless, then the people will rebel and you're not going to have any control at all. So Machiavelli says you got to balance it. And Machiavelli uses Roman emperors as examples, both good and bad. He'll say, look, Caligula, he was a psychopath and nobody respected him and he lost power because he was too cruel. But here's Marcus Aurelius. He had a firm hand. He was a Roman emperor and he had a firm hand. And so he's going to use examples from Greek and the Roman world and from the Bible. One example that might come up is somebody like Moses in the Bible. Moses said, God said, you have to keep the Sabbath day holy. And there's a guy in the Bible who breaks the Sabbath day. He goes and collects food on the Sabbath day. And Moses commands that this guy has to be stoned to death. I don't mean like smoking weed stoned. I mean like they throw rocks at your head until you're dead. That's what I mean when I say stoned to death. So he uses biblical examples and Greek and Roman examples to try to show you how to be a political thinker. He tries to show you how to be an effective leader. And so that's what he was. He was a great political thinker of the Renaissance. His book explains how to gain power and how to keep it, how to use logic and reason over what's right and wrong. He doesn't say it's wrong to kill. He doesn't care about that. He says, look, if you kill too many people, then your people will rebel. But if you don't, put enough fear in them, then they're not going to respect you as the leader. So he's all about logic and reason over what's right and wrong. Again, he uses Greek and Roman and biblical examples. And sometimes people will use the word Machiavellian to describe a cruel or ruthless ruler. But in fact, Machiavelli said you shouldn't be too cruel. He wasn't trying to get people to be cruel. He was just saying what's effective. And so in the conclusion of The Prince, he says, if your people love you, they'll listen to you. And if they fear you, they'll listen to you. And if you have to choose between love and fear, which one's stronger? Which one will get people to do stuff? He says fear. That's like the exact opposite of what Jesus was saying. He was kind of going around saying love and be respect and equality and stuff. Machiavelli says if you want people to do things, they need to fear you. And so that's Machiavelli. This is a rare period of genius after the fall of Constantinople back in the 1450s. The Renaissance is already going because people brought stuff back during the Crusades a couple hundred years earlier. But when Constantinople is taken over by Muslims, thousands of Greek scholars flee to Western Europe and they bring literature with them. Renaissance scholars read Greek and Roman texts in their original languages, not the medieval commentary on ancient texts. They wanted to read stuff in the original. If you wanted to read the Bible in its original, you would have to read the Old Testament in Hebrew. You'd have to read the New Testament in Greek. Medieval scholars translated the entire Bible into Latin. That's not the original. That means that somebody took what was originally written and they translated it. And anytime you translate stuff, you lose stuff. So Renaissance thinkers wanted to get back to the original sources. The writing of the ancient Greek philosopher Plato was translated into Latin for the first time. But a true Renaissance reader would learn Greek so they could read Plato in the original language. But then again, they might study Greek and then translate it into Latin for other people to read. So that's what they love to do, read things in the original. Aristotle was a Greek philosopher, but medieval scholars were already still using him. So people were kind of like, Aristotle's old news. Let's get into Plato. And Plato, even though Plato lived like 1,500 years before the Renaissance, his writings were coming back. That's the entire point of the word Renaissance, the rebirth of these Greek and Roman ideas. There's another Greek philosopher named Ptolemy, right? The P is not pronounced. Ptolemy. He was a Greek astronomer and geographer and mathematician. His ideas start to come to the forefront again. And the writings of Cicero, who lived about the same time as Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, if you're familiar with that kind of stuff, Pompey, and that whole time where the end of the Roman Republic and the beginning of the Roman Empire, his writings were rediscovered. And Petrarch is a scholar who's going to bring some of these writings. Petrarch, we'll talk about him next week. He's kind of the father of the Renaissance. He's the guy who's kind of like rediscovering some of these old Greek or Roman manuscripts. And so I'll probably end this session here talking about Da Vinci because he is the epitome, the absolute best example of the Renaissance, because he wasn't just a painter. He was also a writer and an inventor and a sculptor. Every single slide on this entire slideshow has had Da Vinci work on it, from the Mona Lisa to this Renaissance man to human anatomy and even inventions for, well, like sketches for things, machines that weren't invented till hundreds of years later. So Da Vinci was into everything. He wasn't just a painter, although that's probably what he's most famous for. A Renaissance man means you're well educated and well rounded in lots of different fields. So if somebody is a, quote, Renaissance man, that means he's good in lots of different things. Sometimes people use the word a polymath. So if somebody was a polymath, that means they're good at science and writing and poetry, and they paint a little bit, and they probably play the piano, and they know about history, and they could have an intelligent conversation in lots of different fields. That would be a polymath, somebody who's good and well-rounded, or a Renaissance man. Next week, I'm going to show you a lot of paintings from Da Vinci, like The Last Supper, a painting of Christ and his apostles at the Last Supper. And of course, Mona Lisa is probably the most famous of all of his paintings. But there was other writers and other thinkers as well, like Castiglione, who wrote the Book of the Courtier, who taught civic virtue and Renaissance ideas. This guy Castiglione would say that a true educated polymath has to be well versed in Greek and Roman literature if they really want to be a Renaissance man. Okay, so if you lived back in the 1400s, it would probably still look like the medieval times. There'd still be knights and castles and kings and queens and jousting and sword fighting and no machines, right? They have windmills and stuff, but no like any kind of machines or nothing like that. But things were slowly changing, and that's the whole point of this. Now, at this point, I'm going to close off my notes. Just remember that I have crash course videos, and I also have AP Direct reviews on everything I've talked about. If you need to go into a deeper, process of learning. So we're going to go ahead and close out. And thank you for being here today and for listening to these notes. And we'll go ahead and close.